I'm Dr. William Carson, and I've been working at a private hospital for the past 7 years, a career choice I made not just out of passion, but because of an incident from my childhood that forever changed how I see the medical world. I was only 10 years old when it happened. My parents had just welcomed my younger brother, Ethan, into the world. He was born 2 days before the incident that would scar our family, a tiny, fragile baby with a full head of dark hair and the softest cry I had ever heard. My mother was still recovering in the maternity ward, cradling Ethan in her arms, when one of the nurses approached her. The nurse, her face calm and professional, said she needed to take Ethan for a routine checkup. My mother hesitated, but ultimately handed him over. "It's just a quick test," the nurse assured her, her voice smooth and reassuring. That was the last time we saw Ethan for 10 long, harrowing days. When the nurse returned to the room an hour later, she was holding a baby, but my mother immediately knew something was wrong. "This isn't my son," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and growing panic. The nurse frowned, insisting that it was, but my mother was adamant. "I know my child. Where is Ethan?" Her cries grew louder, drawing the attention of other staff and patients. My father, who had stepped out for coffee, returned to find my mother clutching the strange baby to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she demanded answers. The hospital staff scrambled, claiming it was a misunderstanding, but my parents weren't convinced. The baby they'd returned had lighter hair, a different face, and didn't feel like Ethan. My father, a composed man by nature, called the police immediately, explaining the situation in a voice that betrayed his rising anger. The officers arrived within the hour, taking statements from my parents and the hospital staff, who maintained that there had been no mix-up. Meanwhile, my mother refused to let go of the strange baby, her maternal instincts torn between protecting the child in her arms and the desperate need to find her own. The next 10 days were a nightmare. The police launched an investigation, interviewing nurses, doctors, and anyone who had been on duty that day. My father hired private investigators, sparing no expense in the search for Ethan. My mother, inconsolable, barely slept or ate, spending her days in a haze of grief and rage. I remember sitting by her side, holding her hand, unsure of how to comfort her as I wrestled with my own fear and confusion. On the 5th day, the police uncovered a lead, a nurse named Angela Porter, who had been acting suspiciously. She had abruptly resigned the day after Ethan disappeared and couldn't be reached for questioning. Further investigation revealed that Angela had a history of financial troubles, including large debts that she had struggled to pay off. It didn't take long for the police to connect the dots. Angela had sold Ethan to a family in another city for $50,000. The revelation hit us like a punch to the gut. The idea that someone could take a child and treat him like a commodity was sickening. The breakthrough came on the 10th day when the police, following a trail of bank transactions and phone records, tracked down the family who had purchased Ethan. They were living in a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend on them. When the officers arrived, the family initially denied everything, but their story quickly fell apart under questioning. They admitted to paying Angela for the baby, claiming they had been desperate for a child and didn't know another way. Ethan was found in a crib in their bedroom, unharmed but crying softly, his tiny fists clenched in distress. The moment my parents were reunited with Ethan was both joyous and heartbreaking. My mother collapsed to her knees, clutching him to her chest as sobs racked her body. My father stood beside her, his shoulders shaking with silent tears. The family who had taken Ethan was arrested, along with Angela, who was found hiding in a motel a few miles away. She showed no remorse, even as she was led away in handcuffs, her expression cold and detached. The ordeal left deep scars on our family. My parents became overprotective, especially of Ethan, who grew up surrounded by an almost suffocating level of vigilance. As for me, the incident planted the seed of a desire to become a doctor. I wanted to ensure that no family would have to go through what we did, that hospitals would be places of safety and healing, not betrayal and loss. Years later, as I began my career, I found myself constantly haunted by the memory of Angela Porter and the dark side of human nature she represented. But it wasn't until recently, during a particularly quiet night shift, that the past came back to haunt me in ways I never expected. It started with a series of strange occurrences, a baby monitor in the neonatal unit picking up static-filled whispers, lights flickering in the maternity ward, and the sound of soft, distant crying that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, I dismissed these as mere coincidences, products of an overactive imagination fueled by the eerie stillness of the night. But the events grew harder to ignore. One night, as I made my rounds, I found myself drawn to the maternity ward, the place where Ethan had been taken all those years ago. The hallway was empty, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. As I approached the nursery, I saw a figure standing by the window, silhouetted against the dim light. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized her. The same cold, detached expression, the same piercing eyes. Angela Porter. But it couldn't be. She was in prison, serving a lengthy sentence for her crimes. I stepped closer, my pulse racing, and called out to her. "Angela?" The figure turned slowly, her movements unnaturally stiff, and for a moment I was paralyzed by fear. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a chilling, otherworldly wail that echoed through the empty corridor. The lights flickered violently, plunging the hallway into darkness. When they came back on, she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of antiseptic and something darker, more primal, in the air. I spent the rest of my shift on edge, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The strange occurrences continued over the next few weeks, each more unsettling than the last. Nurses reported seeing a shadowy figure near the nursery, and some even claimed to hear Angela's voice whispering their names in the dead of night. The final straw came when I received a call from the neonatal unit at 3 a.m. A nurse had found a note taped to one of the incubators, written in Angela's handwriting. "He was never yours to keep." The sight of those words sent a shiver down my spine, and I knew I had to confront whatever was haunting the hospital. Armed with nothing but my resolve and a growing sense of dread, I returned to the maternity ward that night, determined to find answers. As I stepped into the hallway, the air grew colder, and the lights flickered again. The whispers started, faint at first but growing louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. "He was never yours to keep," they repeated over and over, until I thought I would go mad. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her again, standing at the end of the hallway, her eyes glowing with an unholy light. This time I didn't hesitate. I ran toward her, my heart pounding, determined to face the specter head on. But as I reached her, she vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness. In her place was another note, this one smeared with what looked like blood. "He's still mine." The message chilled me to my core, and I realized that Angela's spirit wasn't seeking redemption, it was seeking revenge. To this day, the maternity ward remains a place of unease, its shadows longer and darker than anywhere else in the hospital. And though I continue my work, dedicated to healing and helping others, I can't escape the feeling that Angela is still there. My name is Dr. David Price, and I've worked at Hillcrest General Hospital for over a decade. To the outside world, Hillcrest seemed like an ordinary hospital, bustling during the day with patients, nurses, and doctors, and eerily quiet at night. But the truth of what went on behind its walls was far from ordinary, and far more sinister. It began subtly, with rumors whispered among the staff. Equipment had been disappearing, scalpels, monitors, infusion pumps, and even entire surgical kits. The official explanation from the hospital administration was theft. They claimed someone was likely smuggling the equipment out and selling it on the black market, but the whispers among the staff told a darker tale. "We think the hospital is haunted," one of the nurses, Sarah, said to me one evening. I laughed it off, dismissing it as stress-induced paranoia, but Sarah's pale face and trembling hands told me she was serious. What makes you say that?" I asked, humoring. "Strange things happen at night," she said. "Doors slam shut on their own. You hear voices in empty hallways, and last week, Dr. Chambers swore he saw a figure in the operating room, someone who wasn't supposed to be there." I brushed off her concerns, chalking it up to late shifts and overactive imaginations. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the unease creeping over me. Hillcrest had always felt off. The hospital administration decided to bring in an inspection team to investigate the thefts. They arrived one evening, a team of 3 stern-faced officials, armed with clipboards and determination. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the hospital plunged into the quiet hum of night, the team began their work. The hospital administration decided to bring in an inspection team to investigate. The first incident occurred in the basement. The inspection team had gone down to the storage rooms, where much of the missing equipment had supposedly been taken from. Within minutes, the lights began to flicker. One of the inspectors, a woman named Ms. Gardner, called for help over her radio, her voice shaking. "Something's down here," she said. We saw something moving." When security arrived, they found the inspectors huddled in a corner, pale and wide-eyed. "There was a man," Ms. Gardner insisted. "He was standing at the end of the hallway, staring at us. But when we called out to him, he vanished." The security footage from the basement showed nothing unusual, just the inspectors, their flashlights sweeping through the dark corridors. But Ms. Gardner and her team were adamant. As the night wore on, the incidents escalated. Doors slammed shut without warning, monitors beeped erratically, and the elevator began moving between floors on its own. Staff reported hearing whispers in empty hallways, soft, unintelligible voices that sent chills down their spines. By the third night of the investigation, the inspection team was visibly shaken. One of them, Mr. Ellis, decided to quit. "There's something wrong with this place," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't care about the thefts. I'm not staying another night." But the remaining inspectors pressed on, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. Then came the incident in the operating room. It was 3 a.m. when the security cameras caught something truly chilling. The footage showed one of the inspectors, Mr. Hawthorne, entering the operating room alone. He seemed to be searching for something, his flashlight sweeping across the room. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a shadowy figure appeared in the corner. It wasn't a person, at least, not anymore. The figure was translucent, its features distorted as if submerged underwater. It began moving toward Mr. Hawthorne, its movements slow and deliberate. Mr. Hawthorne screamed, dropping his flashlight. The cameras caught his frantic attempts to escape, but the door wouldn't budge. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. When the security team arrived, they found Mr. Hawthorne curled up on the floor, muttering incoherently. He was taken to the psychiatric ward, where he remained catatonic, unable to explain what had happened. The next day, I overheard the administration discussing the situation in hushed tones. "We need to shut this down," one of them said. "The inspectors are getting too close." Too close to what? I wondered. That night, I decided to investigate on my own. Armed with a flashlight and my medical ID, I made my way to the operating room where Mr. Hawthorne had his breakdown. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the silence was oppressive. As I stepped into the room, I noticed something odd, a surgical tray that shouldn't have been there, covered in blood-stained instruments. My flashlight flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. "Leave," it said. I turned around, my heart pounding, and saw them. Figures, at least half a dozen, standing in the shadows. Their faces were pale and lifeless, their eyes hollow. I recognized some of them immediately. Dr. Chambers, Dr. Reed, Dr. Patel, doctors who had supposedly transferred to other hospitals, retired, or simply disappeared without explanation. They moved closer, their translucent forms gliding silently across the room. "You shouldn't be here," one of them said, their voice echoing as if coming from a great distance. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. "To tell the truth," another replied. And then they began to reveal the horrifying truth about Hillcrest. The missing equipment wasn't being stolen. It was being taken by the very doctors who claimed to be victims of the thefts. A group of corrupt staff members had been running an illegal operation, selling the equipment to underground buyers for years. But their greed had come at a price. One night, while attempting to smuggle out a large shipment, they had been caught in a fire in the basement. The blaze consumed them, leaving their bodies unrecognizable. But their spirits had remained, tethered to the hospital by their guilt and greed. And now, they were warning me. "The inspectors must leave," Dr. Chambers said. "If they uncover the truth, they'll meet the same fate we did." Before I could respond, the figures vanished, leaving me alone in the cold, silent room. The following morning, I reported what I had seen to the administration, but they dismissed me, accusing me of overworking myself. But I knew the truth. The ghosts of Hillcrest weren't malevolent. They were trying to protect the living from the horrors that had claimed them. 2 days later, the inspection team was found on the rooftop of the hospital. They were pale and unresponsive, muttering incoherently about figures in the dark. The investigation was quietly shut down, and the missing equipment was never mentioned again. To this day, the halls of Hillcrest remain haunted by the spirits of those who fell victim to its dark secrets. And every night, as I make my rounds, I can feel their presence, a chilling reminder of the price of greed and the ghosts that never rest. My name is Dr. Jonathan Smith, and I've been a doctor at General Hospital since 2009. Over the years, I've seen the best and worst of humanity. I've treated patients who overcame impossible odds and witnessed others succumb to horrors no one should endure. But nothing could have prepared me for the events of one particular night, a night that has haunted me ever since. It began on a quiet Tuesday evening during the graveyard shift. I was finishing up my rounds when I overheard the night nurse, Carla, whispering to another nurse about a new patient. "They brought him in late last night," Carla said, glancing around nervously. "Serial killer. Room 207. I stopped in my tracks. "What was that about a serial killer?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Carla flinched, clearly caught off guard. "Oh, Dr. Smith. Yeah, a man named Vincent Kane. They said he's been in a standoff with the police for weeks. Finally, they got him. but not before he took a bullet to the chest. Vincent Kane. The name struck a chord. I remembered reading about him in the news. Dubbed the Butcher, he was accused of killing at least 7 people, though authorities suspected there were more. Why is he here and not in a prison hospital? I asked, frowning. He was critical, Carla replied, lowering her voice. Closest facility. They have 2 guards outside his room around the clock. I nodded, though unease gnawed at me. Criminals weren't uncommon in hospitals, but someone like Kane, it was enough to make anyone uneasy. As the night dragged on, I tried to push Kane out of my mind. I had other patients to worry about. My next stop was room 213, where a man named Thomas Grayson was admitted earlier that day for severe dehydration and confusion. When I entered the room, the patient was sitting upright, staring out the window. His thin frame was silhouetted by the dim glow of the streetlights outside. Mr. Grayson, I said, stepping closer. I'm Dr. Smith. How are you feeling? He didn't respond at first, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. Then he slowly turned his head toward me. They brought him here, he said in a hoarse whisper. Who? I asked, confused. The butcher, he replied, his voice trembling. I can feel him. He's close. I tried to reassure him. Mr. Grayson, you're safe here. The hospital is heavily secured, but he shook his head violently. You don't understand. It's not the guards you should be worried about. It's him. Something about his tone sent a chill down my spine. Around 2 a.m., the night took a darker turn. I was in the break room when the emergency alarm went off. The sound echoed through the halls, sending a jolt of adrenaline through my body. Carla burst into the room, her face pale. It's Kane, she said breathlessly. He's gone. What do you mean, gone? His room is empty. The guards, she swallowed hard. They're dead. My blood ran cold. This wasn't supposed to happen. Kane was under constant surveillance. How could he have escaped? I followed Carla to room 207. The door was ajar, and the sight inside was enough to make my stomach churn. The 2 guards lay sprawled on the floor, their throats slashed. The bed was empty, the restraints cut cleanly. We're locking down the hospital, Carla said, her voice shaking. I nodded, my mind racing. If Kane was loose in the hospital, everyone was in danger. As the staff scrambled to secure the building, a sudden power outage plunged the hospital into darkness. The emergency generators kicked in, casting an eerie red glow across the halls. The hum of the generators was the only sound, amplifying the oppressive silence. I checked my pager, which buzzed incessantly with messages from other staff members. Reports were coming in of strange noises and flickering lights on various floors. Then came the most chilling message of all. Room 213 is empty. My heart sank. I sprinted to the room, dread building with every step. When I arrived, I found the bed empty, the sheets neatly folded. But something else caught my attention. A single bloody handprint smeared on the window. The chase. The realization hit me like a freight train. Kane wasn't just escaping, he was hunting. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the darkened halls. My mind raced as I pieced together the events. Kane must have been watching the staff, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, he had 2 patients unaccounted for. Thomas Grayson and himself. As I turned a corner, I heard a faint noise, a muffled cry coming from the stairwell. I crept closer, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The stairwell door creaked open, revealing a trail of bloody footprints leading downward. Dr. Smith, don't, Carla's voice called from behind me. But I couldn't just stand there. Someone needed help. The trail led to the hospital basement, a place rarely used except for storage. The air grew colder as I descended, the red emergency lights casting long, unsettling shadows. At the bottom of the stairs, I found Grayson slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with terror. He's here, he whispered. A sudden noise behind me made me spin around. Kane stood there, his face expressionless, a scalpel glinting in his hand. Doctor, he said calmly, his voice sending chills down my spine. You're just in time. Kane moved with a terrifying calmness, his scalpel twirling between his fingers. You're sick, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You need help. He chuckled, the sound hollow and devoid of emotion. Help? Doctor, I'm beyond help, but you might be useful. I glanced at Grayson, who was too weak to move. I had to think fast. Why are you doing this? I asked, stalling for time. Kane tilted his head, as if considering the question. Because I can. Because no one can stop me. I noticed a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall nearby. If I could just distract him long enough. Kane, I said, stepping closer. This doesn't have to end like this. But he wasn't listening. He lunged at me, the scalpel aimed for my throat. I dodged at the last second, grabbing the fire extinguisher and swinging it with all my strength. The impact sent Kane sprawling to the floor. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. I grabbed Grayson and half-carried, half-dragged him up the stairs. By the time we reached the main floor, the police had arrived. Officers swarmed the hospital, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Kane was found in the basement, unconscious but alive. He was restrained and taken into custody, though not without a fight. Grayson was stabilized and transferred to another facility far from the horrors of that night. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only just scratched the surface of Kane's madness. My name is James Carter, and for over a decade I've worked as the night security guard at Ravenswood Private Hospital, a place where whispers of the past linger in its sterile halls, and where the dead find their final rest in the basement morgue. When I first took the job in 2010, I thought it would be simple, an easy paycheck for keeping the place secure while the doctors and nurses handled emergencies upstairs. My duties involved patrolling the building, ensuring that doors were locked, checking surveillance monitors, and occasionally escorting late-night staff to their cars. The morgue, located in the far corner of the basement, was a place I rarely needed to visit unless maintenance staff reported an issue. Over the years, I'd heard plenty of rumors about strange happenings down there. Drawers opening by themselves, shadows moving in the corners, and cold spots that made even the bravest nurses refuse to enter alone. I dismissed it all as nonsense, stories invented to pass the long, boring shifts. But all of that changed one night. A night I wish I could forget, but the events have burned themselves into my mind like a brand, a constant reminder of the line I crossed into something that defied explanation. It was late November, the kind of night where the chill seeped into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. The hospital was unusually quiet. The ER had seen only a trickle of patients, and the rest of the building felt like a tomb. Around 2 a.m., I sat in the monitoring room sipping my third cup of coffee, half listening to the hum of the old CRT monitors showing grainy footage of empty hallways. My eyelids felt heavy, and I fought the pull of sleep as the minutes dragged on. Then something caught my eye on the screen. The camera feed for the basement flickered, static crackling across the image before it steadied again. I leaned closer, frowning as I saw that the morgue doors, which I distinctly remembered locking during my earlier rounds, were now slightly ajar. A shadow passed briefly across the frame, a fleeting blur that disappeared before I could make sense of it. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was probably just a glitch or a janitor forgetting to close up. Still, protocol demanded I check it out. Grabbing my flashlight and radio, I made my way down the dimly lit corridors toward the stairwell. As I descended into the basement, the air grew colder, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting an unnatural sickly glow. The morgue was at the end of the hallway, its metal double doors gleaming under the flickering lights. The moment I stepped closer, a strange sensation washed over me, a prickling at the back of my neck, as though unseen eyes were watching. "Anyone down here?" I called out, my voice echoing in the emptiness. No response. When I reached the doors, I pushed one open cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Inside, the morgue was just as I'd left it, rows of metal drawers lining the walls, an autopsy table in the center, and a faint antiseptic smell lingering in the air. Yet something felt off, a heaviness I couldn't shake. I scanned the room with my flashlight, and that's when I noticed it. One of the drawers was slightly open, the corner of a white sheet hanging out like a beckoning hand. Swallowing hard, I stepped closer, my boots clicking loudly against the tiled floor. The drawer's label read, "Unidentified Male, DOA," and the date of death was from 2 nights ago. I hesitated, my fingers trembling as I reached out to push the drawer shut. As soon as I touched the handle, a loud clang reverberated through the room, making me jump. Spinning around, I saw that the autopsy tools on the table had fallen to the floor, though no one else was there. My heart raced as I told myself it was just the vibrations from my movement, but deep down, I didn't believe it. Taking a shaky breath, I turned back to the drawer, determined to finish and leave. But as I pushed the drawer closed, I heard it, a faint, guttural whisper, like the scrape of wind through a crack. It sounded like my name, James. My flashlight wavered as I spun around again, shining it into every corner, my pulse pounding in my ears. The room was empty, yet the whisper persisted, growing louder and more distinct. "James, why are you here?" Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the drawer I'd just closed slid open again, this time with force, slamming against the stop. The sheet that had been covering the body was now crumpled on the floor, and the slab was empty. My flashlight shook as I scanned the room, searching for any sign of the corpse. The whispering turned into low, mocking laughter, echoing all around me, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Panic surged through me as the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before they came back on. That's when I saw them, shadows crawling along the walls, human-shaped but distorted, their movements jerky and unnatural. One by one, they emerged from the walls, forming grotesque figures that filled the room. Their eyes glowed faintly, pinpricks of light in the dark, and their mouths stretched into impossible, sinister grins. I stumbled backward, tripping over the autopsy table and landing hard on the floor. The figures closed in, their whispers now a cacophony of voices, each one dripping with malice. "You don't belong here," they hissed in unison. I scrambled to my feet, clutching my flashlight like a weapon, though I knew it would do no good. Desperate, I bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the thick metal absorbed my cries. Turning back, I saw the shadows circling me, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. One of them lunged forward, its icy hand gripping my wrist, and a searing pain shot through me. Images flooded my mind, visions of the dead, their faces contorted in agony, their final moments replaying like a broken reel. I saw doctors and nurses frantically working to save lives, only for those lives to slip away, their spirits lingering in this cursed place. The shadow released me, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. My flashlight had rolled away, leaving me in near total darkness save for the faint glow of the figures. Then, from the far corner of the room, a new figure emerged. This one was different, solid, human, dressed in a tattered hospital gown stained with blood. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his mouth twisted into a sneer. "Welcome to my domain," he said, his voice cold and hollow. "I've been waiting for someone like you." He stepped closer, and I saw the jagged scars crisscrossing his neck, as though he'd been strangled or hanged. "They thought they could forget about me, lock me away down here with the others," he continued, gesturing to the shadows. "But we remember. We always remember." His presence filled the room with a suffocating dread, and I could barely breathe under its weight. "You will join us," he whispered, reaching out a hand. In that moment, adrenaline surged through me, and I lunged for the flashlight, gripping it tightly as I swung it at the figure. The beam of light seemed to momentarily disrupt him, his form flickering like a bad signal. Seizing the chance, I scrambled to the control panel near the door, my fingers fumbling with the keys as I tried to override the lock. The whispers grew louder, a deafening roar that made my head feel like it would split open. Finally, the door clicked open, and I burst out into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached the stairwell, my lungs burning and my heart threatening to burst from my chest. When I reached the monitoring room, I frantically rewound the footage, desperate to prove to myself that what I'd seen was real. But the feed was blank, static where the morgue camera should have been. The other cameras showed only me, stumbling through the halls alone. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next morning, but he dismissed it as exhaustion and suggested I take a few days off. I never went back. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that morgue or why I was targeted. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I can hear the faint whispers of the dead calling my name, reminding me of the horrors that lurk beneath Ravenswood's polished surface. My name is Dr. Samuel Gray, and I've been the night doctor at Black Ridge Private Hospital for almost 7 years. The night shifts are usually uneventful, with the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional soft patter of nurses' shoes breaking the monotony, but I prefer the stillness. It allows me to focus and, if I'm honest, avoid the chaos of daytime emergencies. Yet, one night, in the eerie stillness of 4 a.m., something happened that changed how I viewed the shadows of this hospital forever. It started in the emergency operating room, where I was called in to assist with a patient who'd arrived in critical condition, a young man who had been attacked, bleeding profusely from a knife wound to his abdomen. The nurses were tense, their voices clipped as they passed me instruments and monitored the patient's vitals. The air felt thick, oppressive even, as if the hospital itself knew something was wrong. The surgery lasted 2 hours. We managed to stabilize the patient, and I left the operating room exhausted but satisfied, knowing we'd saved another life. As I walked down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the break room, I noticed an odd detail, the sound of faint footsteps echoing behind me, too soft to belong to a nurse or orderly. Turning around, I found the corridor empty, the shadows still and unmoving. I shrugged it off, blaming my exhaustion for playing tricks on me, and continued toward the break room. But the feeling didn't go away. It clung to me, an unsettling awareness that I wasn't alone. I reached the door, pushed it open, and froze. There, sitting in one of the chairs at the far end of the room, was a man I didn't recognize. He was hunched over, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood, and he didn't seem to notice me. His clothes were tattered, stained with what looked like dirt and dried blood. "Excuse me, this area is for staff only," I said, my voice firm but laced with unease. The man slowly raised his head, and I took an involuntary step back. His face was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. His lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile, and he muttered something under his breath, too soft for me to hear. Before I could respond, he stood and walked past me, his movements unnaturally fluid, almost like he was gliding. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I watched him disappear into the hallway, his footsteps eerily silent. Shaking off the encounter, I reported it to security, who assured me they'd check the cameras and patrol the area. I tried to return to my duties, but the sense of unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The next night, the man appeared again, this time in the waiting area near the ER. A nurse named Clara saw him first and came running to me, her face pale with fear. "Dr. Gray, there's a man in the waiting room, and he's not right," she stammered. When I arrived, the room was empty, save for the faint smell of something rotten, like decaying leaves. Security was called again, but they found no trace of him. Over the following nights, reports of the man began to spread among the staff. Orderlies claimed to see him lurking in the stairwells, nurses swore they heard his voice whispering their names, and patients complained of a cold, suffocating presence during the quiet hours. Each time, security would sweep the area, finding nothing but static-laden footage on the cameras. Things escalated 2 days later when a cleaner reported seeing the man on the rooftop. He described the figure standing at the edge, looking out over the city, before vanishing into the darkness. That same night, as I made my rounds, I heard something in the hallway near the ICU, a low, guttural laugh that sent a shiver down my spine. Following the sound, I saw him again, standing in front of room 213. The air around him seemed to warp, and the hallway grew unnaturally cold. I called out to him, demanding to know who he was and what he wanted, but he only turned to me with that same chilling smile before stepping into the room. When I entered seconds later, he was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of decay. Room 213 housed an elderly patient who'd suffered a stroke earlier that week. She was unconscious, her monitors beeping steadily, but as I checked on her, I noticed something odd, a small antique locket clutched in her hand. It wasn't there earlier, and I couldn't explain how it got there. Feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, I pocketed the locket, intending to hand it over to security, but the moment I touched it, a sharp pain shot through my chest, and I heard a whisper in my ear, "He sees you." I dropped the locket and stumbled back, gasping for air as the room spun. The locket lay on the floor, its delicate chain twisted like a noose. The culmination came 2 nights later. Security, now on high alert, had stationed guards throughout the hospital. Around 3 a.m., a motion detector on the rooftop triggered an alarm, and the guards rushed to investigate. I followed, drawn by morbid curiosity and a sense of responsibility. When we reached the rooftop, the scene was surreal. The man was there, standing at the edge, his back to us, his tattered clothes billowing in the wind. One of the guards called out to him, ordering him to step away, but he didn't move. As we approached, the air grew colder, and the faint smell of decay returned. Finally, the man turned to face us, and for the first time, I saw the full extent of his horror. His face was a grotesque mask of rotting flesh, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light, and his smile stretched impossibly wide, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. Before we could react, he lunged at one of the guards, passing through him like a shadow. The guard collapsed, clutching his chest and gasping for air, as the man turned his attention to me. "You should have left me alone," he growled, his voice a distorted blend of anger and sorrow. Then as quickly as he appeared, he vanished, leaving us in stunned silence. The guard recovered, shaken but unharmed, and we scoured the rooftop, finding no sign of the man. However, near the edge where he'd stood, we discovered a pile of stolen items. Wallets, jewelry, and personal belongings reported missing over the past week. Among them was the antique locket I'd seen in room 213. The police were called, and an investigation revealed a chilling truth. The man was identified as a thief who had died in the hospital 5 years ago after falling from the rooftop while attempting to evade capture. His body was never claimed, and his spirit, it seemed, had lingered, trapped in the place of his death. The stolen items were evidence of his restless torment, his need to reclaim what he'd lost in life. To this day, the staff at Black Ridge Private Hospital refuse to discuss the incident, and the rooftop remains locked at night. But I can't forget the look in his eyes, the cold weight of his presence, and the haunting realization that some spirits never find peace.